Chapter 11. Skepticism. Walking around the rainforest biome late that Sunday afternoon, the professor spent some enjoyable time with Rachel and her young son Jordan as they attended to the animals. Having been stripped of many of his professional duties by the ethics committee, and on his summer break, Jax had more time on his hands than he was used to. Since it was the weekend, Rachel had brought her 5-year-old son in to see where she worked. The young boy was enthralled with the monkeys and the reptiles, but not entirely sure about the jaguar, saying to his mother, "He has mean eyes." Passing by the library, the professor was surprised to see Evan and Seth sitting at a table deep in discussion. For a moment he hesitated, and then he noticed that his big framed portrait, which had hung over the doorway ever since the biome had opened, had been taken down. Swallowing hard, he nodded glumly to himself. He was being marginalized in every area of the Greenville University where he had once been held in high esteem. In anticipation of a negative outcome at the upcoming tribunal hearings, his portraits were being removed. Distantly, he heard Evan say, "What evidence is there, aside from the Bible, that Jesus truly existed?" The howler monkeys started up a roaring chorus. Glancing over in his direction, Evan was surprised to see the professor standing in the hallway. "Hey, come join us," he called out warmly. Feeling rather dejected, Jax was in the mood for a stimulating conversation. With a smile, he jested, "Whose decision was it to put those monkeys so close to the library?" Evan laughed, and then explained to Seth that the professor had planned everything. "But it makes a good first impression when people enter the main doors," he assured his mentor, noticing the sadness in his eyes. Once the professor was seated and the monkeys had settled down, Evan told him, "I just asked Seth your question about whether there is evidence for a historical Jesus." Seth smiled and nodded at Jax. Having just read a few pertinent articles, he was longing to share what he'd learned. "So you want to know if there's evidence outside of the Bible that Jesus existed?" "Seems a fair question to me," the older scientist replied wearily, resting his arms on the table. "What would it take to convince you?" Seth asked. The monkeys started up again. Looking dubious, Jax paused to consider his answer and then spoke loudly. "If you could show me 20 independent, non-Christian accounts of Jesus' life within the first century that he lived, then I'd likely believe." "Nothing less than that?" "Probably not." "Do you need 20 accounts to verify that Plato existed?" "No, we have his writings." "You also have Jesus' words recorded by his closest friends." "But that's in the Bible, which we have good reason to doubt." "Well, first of all," Seth answered, "I just have to say this. Healthy skepticism is good because it keeps us from being duped by lies, and there are a lot of lies in our world today. Radical skepticism, on the other hand, which rejects reasonable evidence and demands proof beyond any possible doubt, can actually conceal our determination not to believe. We can even fool ourselves by this type of reasoning." For a moment, the roaring monkeys were so loud that the conversation paused. Looking at his phone, the professor saw it was 6:30. "It's just feeding time," he said dismissively. "Once Rachel and Jordan bring those monkeys their food, they'll settle down." Seth smiled at Evan. They had been introduced to the cheery, dark-haired young lad who was proudly helping his mum. Looking over at Seth, Jax assured him loudly, "Okay, if you can give me 20 independent, non-Christian accounts, I will believe." "If I showed you those tonight," Seth called out over the noise, "would you be happy to see the evidence? Or," he smiled kindly, "would you quickly think of some other reasons to keep doubting?" The noise ceased almost instantly. "That's a little unfair," Jax protested. "I suppose since you can't show me 20 accounts, you're calling my request radical skepticism." Seth shrugged. "Well, what if you said to me, the Bible can't be proven true unless I can interview the authors? Would you call that healthy skepticism or asking for the impossible? Can the writings of Plato or Isaac Newton be proven genuine through personal interviews with the authors? If the evidence we demand to see would invalidate all other ancient writings, then we aren't making fair requests. I didn't ask to interview the authors, Jack stated defensively, having never thought of himself as a radical skeptic before. Reluctantly, he revised his demand, asking, "Okay, can you show me any independent, non-Christian accounts of Jesus within 100 years of his life?" "I can," Seth nodded confidently. Pulling up an article on his phone, he said, "There are at least 4 non-Christian independent accounts that are verifiable." Showing him the information on the screen, he pointed them out. Tacitus, a Roman historian writing around 115 to 200 CE, mentions Christus, who was executed by Pontius Pilate and from whom the Christians derived their name. Scrolling down, he added, Josephus, a Jewish historian who was born a few years after Jesus was crucified, was considered by most Jews a traitor because he worked with the Romans, and he was not a Christian. He had no ulterior motive to support Christians in his writing, yet in his historical account, Jewish Antiquities, he mentions that James was the brother of Jesus, who is called Messiah, and speaks of him teaching the people and being crucified by Pilate. The professor quietly considered the accounts as Seth read. Lucian of Samosata, a Greek satirist living in 115 to 200 CE, wrote, "The passing of Peregrinus." His writings clearly show that he was not a Christian, as he derided those who, having convinced themselves that they are going to be immortal and live forever, the poor wretches despise death and most even willingly give themselves up. Yet he refers to the believers as Christians, who worship the man who was crucified in Palestine because he introduced this new cult into the world. Scrolling down, Seth added, Pliny the Younger, who knew Tacitus and was a Roman governor, speaks of Christians singing hymns to Christ as a god. So that's 4, Seth stated, Tacitus, Josephus, Lucian, and Pliny. Scanning the online article, the professor could see that it had proper citations and references. That's 4, Jax repeated flatly. They are all writing within 200 years after Jesus supposedly died. With a slight twinkle in his eye, he suggested, perhaps by then the Christian fables had integrated into society so much that people just referred to them as we would Santa Claus. You know that there's no archaeological evidence that Jesus existed. Jesus wasn't wealthy, Seth argued dismissively. His purpose wasn't to establish monuments or even own a house. And he only spent 3 days in the tomb of another man. There was no time or need to engrave his name on the rocks. However, he said, looking directly at the professor, there is physical evidence that Roman crucifixion was occurring at this point in history. When historians want to verify a historical account, they check that the details are in accord with the practices of the time. They check that the recorded names of government officials match with other historical records of the same time period, which they do in the Gospels. They check that recorded occupations match the local customs of the time period, which they do in the Gospels. Geographical descriptions of food, coins, measurements, agricultural practices, animal industry, places of worship, and social norms are all in keeping with what is known of this time period and the Gospel accounts. All the details recorded by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John display this type of accurate insider information, and nothing is out of place. Ooh la la! The writers obviously did some careful research, Jack acknowledged with a grin. That's why their lies spread so well. Seth and Evan exchanged glances. In the distance, they could hear the macaws calling out in the bird sanctuary. Rachel's made it all the way around, the professor smiled. They'll be heading home soon. Lies, eh? Seth reflected. Our entire calendar system is based on the life of Jesus Christ. That's quite amazing if he never existed. Jack smiled. Did you know, Evan interjected, that of all the classical ancient works, the New Testament has by far the greatest number of surviving copies? Most ancient works have a dozen or so copies, and that's all. Homer's Iliad has the second most surviving reproductions, nearly 2,000. But there are 20,000 New Testament manuscripts. That doesn't surprise me, the professor replied evenly. A lot of people were duped, and they all wanted a copy. The New Testament radicalized people. People were so sure it was true that they made crazy decisions. But all truth is subjective. Is that a true statement? Seth prodded. What do you mean? Is the saying, all truth is subjective, true or false? The young man argued. If all truth is subjective, then your statement can't be verified. Jax began shaking his head. Don't get me wrong, the red-haired student continued. I believe there is subjective truth, like our own personal preferences. You may feel blue is the best color, and that may be true for you, but not for me because I love green. But Jesus' life, death, and resurrection are based on real historical events, and therefore they are absolute truth, not subjective. If I can't study it through my 5 senses, then it can't be proven true, the professor debated, enjoying the argument. Having read such sentiments in the professor's book, Seth had done his investigation and found answers to the challenging questions. With a smile, he retorted, but yet you are trusting your own reasoning, which you can't study with those 5 senses, to be a reliable guide in determining the truth. According to your worldview, your brain evolved to help you survive, not to determine the truth. Nodding, the professor chuckled. Seth wasn't an easy pushover, and he had some valid points. Evan had also thought these matters through since Seth had put him on the spot about missionary work in paradise. He piped up, saying, Let me explain one of the most powerful proofs that I found as strong evidence that Jesus truly existed and rose from the dead. Looking at the professor, he asked kindly, Jax, what might motivate someone to make up a lie and promote it all over the world? Fame? Pride? The professor suggested. If someone published a lie on social media that the whole world believed, they might feel quite proud of themselves. In agreement, Evan continued. So, some might tell lies to get fame, make money, obtain power, or gain some other pleasures for themselves. Lies are often told to avoid painful consequences. In fact, our world is overwhelmed with fake news and lies, he said, shaking his head in dismay, to the point where we hardly know what to believe anymore. But think about this. The early Christians were persecuted for those beliefs they promoted. Most of the disciples lost their lives because they chose to keep preaching a resurrected Messiah, regardless of the violent threats they received. Many early Christians were martyred, crucified, fed to lions, hung, beaten, mocked, and shamed. They had to leave their homes, sometimes their families, give up jobs and status, and they didn't stand to gain anything material in this life. In the gospel accounts, Jesus clearly warned them ahead of time that anyone who wanted to follow him had to take up their cross to do so. As I see it, there's only one powerful reason that people will refuse to recant under threats of losing everything, and that is if they feel the truth they profess is absolutely certain and so valuable it must be shared with others. Satalors! Why would anyone want to bring such a terrible fate on people they care about? Jax frowned. Because their hope is for a better resurrection, Seth replied. They were looking forward to eternal life in the future with Jesus. And that's why Christians become radicalized, Jax reasoned anxiously. That's why the Bible is so dangerous. People lose their focus on the here and now and will do anything for some fanciful vision that may never come true. Seth groaned. Maybe, the professor conceded, attempting to be fair. The disciples were confused and thought that Jesus had died when he didn't. Perhaps they didn't mean to promote a lie. They just thought they had witnessed a miracle that didn't really occur. So he was taken off the cross and put in the cave still alive? Seth queried. Jax nodded. Looking at the distinguished scientist dubiously, Seth followed through with the suggestion. And then 3 days later, completely healed from being beaten, tortured, crucified, and thrust through with a spear, Jesus wriggled out of the linen wrappings, moved the heavy stone, and overcame trained soldiers? Is that possible? Jack shrugged. Even if the disciples got past all the guards Pilate had set in place and managed to carry him out of the tomb, Seth argued, how could he have fully recovered only 3 days later? Even if they had access to antibiotics, that would be incredibly fast healing. Whether he was miraculously healed or resurrected, both would involve God's supernatural intervention. Recognizing the improbability of the situation, the older scientist tried another tact. So, maybe just the New Testament is valid. Seth shook his head slowly. Jesus himself recognized the authority of the Old Testament, he explained. How? Giving examples, Seth listed, he directly quoted from it to defeat his temptations to sin. At the end of the Gospel of Luke, he quoted from the law and the prophets in order to prove to others that he was a true Messiah. He said that his role was to fulfill the law and not to destroy it. Many times when he was teaching, he said, "It is written," or "Have you not read?" in reference to the Old Testament scriptures. Jax pondered the matter silently. Rachel and Jordan had finished feeding the animals and called out their goodbyes from the doorway. The three debaters waved cheerily and said goodbyes of their own. Jordan was excited. "The jaguar ate his steak in one bite," he told them, astonished. "But he left the grapes." "He might come back for dessert later," Jax chuckled. "And the mummy monkey wouldn't share her apple." "Good thing you have a nice mummy," Evan quipped. Jordan nodded and reached out for his mother's hand. "I'll be waiting to hear about the patients," Rachel called out. "I should hear soon," Jax assured her, looking quickly at his phone in case he'd missed a message, but he hadn't. They all waved again and the Khalids departed hand in hand for home. Returning to their discussion about whether or not Jesus had endorsed the Old Testament, Evan had a few more things to add. Jesus spoke of God creating Adam and Eve as though this were an established fact, he noted. In fact, Jesus referred to many Old Testament people like Noah and Lot, David, Jonah, Abel, and Zechariah. Never once did he insinuate that they were myths. He even spoke with Moses and Elijah in the Transfiguration, Seth added. If we think that Jesus taught a different God, it's more likely that we simply don't understand the Old Testament correctly. "Perhaps," the professor acknowledged slowly. "But I find it really hard to understand or even like the God of the Old Testament." Looking up kindly, Seth said, Sometimes we dislike people because of what others have said about them, but when we actually get to know them ourselves, we may discover the rumors are wrong. They may become our best friends. I think it's the same with God. Many past events have been taken out of context and spun in the worst possible ways without giving the whole story." Nodding, the professor admitted this could be true. He had never read the whole Bible from cover to cover, only small sections here and there. "Remember what you always told us in class," Evan encouraged. "Follow the evidence wherever it leads." Jax chuckled, knowing he had often added, "It doesn't matter how fantastic your theory is. If it doesn't hold up to experiment, if it doesn't match the evidence you discover, then it's not viable. Throw it out and start again. Science doesn't progress by holding on to established theories, but by following the evidence." Internally, he pondered, "Are there documented proofs I'm refusing to consider because I want to cling to my favorite hypothesis? Have I become a radical skeptic, refusing reasonable evidence?" The conversation had given him plenty to think about. Rising from the table, he thanked the young men for the interesting discussion and headed back to his office. He hoped he would soon get a report from Amy. Chapter 12. Suffering. As prearranged, Evan and Seth went out for dinner that evening after their chat with the professor. Sitting down in a private booth for two, right next to a big screen TV, Evan noticed a breaking news banner headline. "Hey, look at that," he said. Seth read, "A special report tonight on the Tinies, right after the 6 o'clock news." "Paradise has made the headlines," the redhead exclaimed. "It's all over social media." "I know. Donations and cards are pouring in," Evan nodded. "We aren't quite sure what to do. Although the professor is facing heavy fines for his unethical use of reproductive material, he is appreciative of the assistance toward keeping Paradise running." A young waitress approached their table. "Can I get you anything to drink?" she asked politely. Both of them asked for water and were ready to order. The half-chicken dinner with fries and sauce was within their meager student budgets. "How are the burn victims?" Seth asked, once the waitress had taken their order. "The next 2 nights will be crucial for Zahir and Ponzi," Evan fretted. "Apparently this is when infection generally sets in, and it's critical to get the meds just right. How will you know if you got them correct? If their temperatures start going up, the doctors will recalculate the antibiotics. No one has ever treated someone so small." "So I suppose the new nurses will be checking their vitals?" Seth nodded. "Can someone communicate with you now that Uncle Louis is confined to bed?" Evan explained the whole situation in the way they had taught Amy to use a phone. He also told him about the Khalid's willingness to do anything for the Tinies and all the medical supplies they had donated. A beep sounded on his phone. He took it out to look at the message. It was his friend Jim asking how things were going. "Sorry, Seth," Evan apologized, putting the phone down on the table and choosing to respond later. "We're waiting to hear from Amy tonight. Hopefully she'll give us a full report." "I know a lot of people are asking this question," Seth prodded, "but does Dr. Khalid feel confident that everyone will recover?" Evan looked over at Seth's concerned face. "There are no guarantees," he said soberly. "We're waiting to see how the boys pull through in the next few days. Louis's prognosis is poor, since obviously surgery can't be done, and his heart attack damaged a lot of the muscle." "I'm really sorry to hear that," Seth replied in dismay. "Louis pushed himself to the limit to save Paradise, and now he's just going to die. And that's that. Can't we give him something more?" With a desperate look on his face, he appealed, "Evan, is there any way we can share the message of salvation with him?" Evan smiled at his younger friend. "Seth, I invited you to dinner tonight because I have something very important to tell you. You won't believe what has happened in this last week since the fire. I could have just sent you a message, but this news is worth a fine dining celebration. I believe your prayers were answered." Astonished, Seth looked up. "Really? How?" As they waited for their chicken dinners to arrive, Evan filled him in on the particulars. He told him about Louis's discovery of the Bible online weeks before the fire, and of his insistence while in the emergency lab that he be allowed to have God's book in Paradise. "Louis feels that his prayers were answered," Evan exclaimed. "He is determined to do a search for truth and find out whose book he agrees with more, the professor's or God's. If you still have that small copy of the Bible, Seth, I'm actually allowed to send it in." Seth's green eyes were wide with wonder. Trying to process everything Evan had told him, he clarified, "So Louis has already discovered the Bible online? And Professor Lemans has agreed to allow God's book to enter Paradise?" Evan nodded happily. The young student was overjoyed. "This is definitely worth celebrating and thanking God. And yes, I have that Bible," he exclaimed. "And I've already marked in some key cross-references and notes, just in case an opportunity came up." Evan explained the details. Louis promised he would share the Bible only with those in the crisis room for now, and that he would also read the professor's book to them. Continuing on, he explained the whole discussion that had taken place between the professor, himself, and Louis. He even showed Seth the messages Louis had typed on his phone. "Unreal," Seth smiled. "I would never have dreamed it could happen this way. I would love to meet Louis. What an amazing guy he is. I'll bring the Bible to you early tomorrow morning." "Here are your meals," the waitress said, handing them both overflowing plates of food, mostly fries. "Let me know if you need anything else." Both men thanked her, and then Seth suggested they say a prayer. Bowing their heads, he prayed earnestly. "Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for our lives and the privilege of calling you our Father. We thank you for this good meal, our health, and our friendship. We know that all good things come from you. We are thankful that you found a way to enlighten Louis even before we prayed. And we are astounded at this remarkable opportunity for your word to enter Paradise. Please bless the Tinies with this opportunity to find your precious salvation." In a more sober tone, Seth begged, "We ask now for direction in determining how to care for the Tinies. All life originates and is sustained by your power. None of us can exist without your life-giving spirit breath, and you care for all of us, no matter how small or insignificant we may be. Please save Sahir and Ponzi from infection. We live in an age when science has overreached its boundaries and tinkered with your creation in ways that surely bring grief to you. For the professor to take your gift of life to those who are made in your image and miniaturize them to bring glory to himself is truly wrong. Please forgive him this wrong. Please help him to give you the glory as the wonderful designer, creator, and father that you are. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, your beloved Son, we pray. Amen." Silently, the two science students began eating their meals. Evan was deep in thought over Seth's prayer. He had never considered apologizing to God for what he and the professor had done, Yet he had been feeling very uncomfortable ever since he realized it was wrong to modify human life in such a drastic way. Had they tried to bring glory to themselves by misusing their knowledge? Yes, he had to admit, he had desired to see his name emblazoned across social media and in exclusive scientific research magazines. Such personal revelations deeply disturbed his conscience. The silence extended uncomfortably for a few minutes as they munched on their fries and dipped their chicken into the delicious sauce. And God is my Father, Evan pondered inwardly. I belong to him. He notices me. Maybe he even loves me. Have I disappointed him by what I have done? Have I misused my abilities in altering the lives of others who are made in his image? The tall researcher was filled with anxious regret, and he stopped eating. I'm sorry, Seth apologized. Evan, I should have talked to you about this first. While I was praying, I just felt the urgency of the situation with Sahir and Ponzi in critical care, and I was strongly moved to ask for God's forgiveness. Evan nodded, sitting back in his chair. In a remorseful tone, he agreed, You're right, Seth. With a sigh and a shake of his head, he added, I know you're right. What we've done with paradise is wrong in God's eyes. I fully admit it. These little people could have become regular human beings had we not shrunk them down. At the time, I thought it was a fantastic experiment to be involved with, and I thought it'd be really fun for them. I didn't fully think about how short their lives would be, or that they might hope for something more, or that we were trying to bring glory to ourselves. Seth looked up sadly. With remorse, Evan confessed, I was wrong to get involved with this. I suppose I should also pray and personally ask God for forgiveness. We need to set things right, Seth agreed. God will forgive those who sincerely repent and desire to change. I'll pray when I get home, Evan promised. I get it now. Wiping his mouth with his napkin, he laid down his fork. He had completely lost his appetite. With a sigh, he pleaded, But Seth, I'm in too deep to get out of this. I have to see this project through to the end. I can't abandon the Tinies or even Professor Lemans. They need me. They certainly do, Seth agreed. What's already done can't be undone. You are responsible for their lives. Nodding, Evan relayed wistfully, I should tell you that I've been experimenting to try and find a way to change the Tinies back to a real human size. Looking up with astonishment, Seth exclaimed, Really? Is that even possible? How would that even work? Shrugging his shoulders, Evan replied, I've seen it happen randomly with the sunflower and a whole group of butterflies and moths that we sent into the dome. I know it's possible somehow. I've been experimenting with fish eggs, but so far no success. I've spent hours and hours trying to find a way to undo our mistake. Seth sighed. Evan, I feel that a lot of the damage humans have done to God's creation can only be undone by God himself. Considering this for a moment, the redhead suggested, If it's God's will that his creation is brought back to him, then maybe you should pray for his wisdom to guide you. Perhaps all of this should simply be left in our Father's hands. This was a new thought for Evan. He looked long and hard at Seth. I'll do that, he said remorsefully. Tonight, I'll pray for forgiveness and ask for God to guide me. Guide us. A bing sounded on Evan's phone. It was a report from Amy. She had sent a white dove message to both the professor and his assistant. Still sitting at the restaurant table, Evan read it to Seth. Zahir and Ponzi have elevated fevers of 39 degrees Celsius. They have slept almost the whole day and are still too sleepy to open their eyes or hear me talking to them. It's been very hard getting them to drink the medicine. That doesn't sound good, Seth frowned. Evan texted back right away. Ensure they drink all their medicine, however long it takes. Try dipping cloths in lukewarm water and placing them on their foreheads and chest to get those temperatures down. Let us know in a few hours if it's still rising. A response from the professor came in right after his, saying much the same and requesting an immediate video call with her. Looking up at Seth, Evan relayed soberly, Well, we did expect elevated temperatures today and tomorrow. Hopefully we can monitor this carefully and keep their fevers under control." Seth looked at him with a troubled expression. Minutes later, the special news report on the large TV screen in the restaurant caught Evan's attention. "We're all on the edge of our seats, hoping that Zahir and Ponzi will have a favorable recovery," the female reporter was saying. "Professor Lemans has informed us that Dr. Farouk Khalid and Dr. Montgomery, two of Greenville's finest doctors, are working closely with him to assess the medical needs. The next 2 days will be critical for the burn victim's recovery. Nurse Amy has been educated on how to use a smartphone, and they are all waiting to hear from her this evening. She has been asked to report on their vitals every day. No doctor has ever studied or medicated a tiny before. It's all a bit of a guessing game, although these doctors are basing their estimates on much more knowledge than I'll ever have." As other patrons in the restaurant craned their necks to see the TV screen, the co-reporter nodded. "Or most of us," she added. "Dr. Khalid trained at a prestigious hospital in Israel and has been working at the Greenville University Hospital in the cardiac ward for the past 8 years. His wife, Dr. Rachel Khalid, is the head animal doctor at the Biosphere. Dr. Montgomery is our resident specialist who has developed a highly successful burn treatment formula right here in Greenville, which has gone worldwide. All three have contributed greatly to our community and scientific research. And now," the other reporter announced, "in case you haven't seen it already on social media, we have actual footage of the shocking catastrophe that happened only days ago in Paradise." Across the screen came a video of the fire. Many of the tinies were lined up, passing water pots to the frontline firefighters. Zahir and Louis' heroic effort to save Ponzi had been captured, but the video ended abruptly. "That's when I told them all to leave," Evan remarked ruefully to Seth. Commenting on the injured victims and heroic medics, the reporters displayed a few older pictures that the professor had sent in from happier days. One picture, which had already gone viral the week before, was from the first celebration in Paradise. Wearing her white celebration dress, Amy was singing with Zahir, and a large group of tinies stood around them. Smiling, the reporter elaborated, "I'm sure most of you have heard the beautiful love song created and sung in Paradise, trending now across social media. Amy is the female singer here in the white dress. Tragically, her handsome duet partner Zahir was one of the most severely injured in the fire after risking his life to save a fellow tiny. Unfortunately, Zahir is likely to have serious scarring across his face and limbs. Not only did Zahir and Ponzi suffer in this incident, but Uncle Louis, as he is affectionately called, had a near-fatal heart attack in his efforts to help the young men. According to Professor Lemans, Amy's immediate assistance and successful CPR brought him back to life. At this moment, Nurse Amy and 4 other tinies are caring for the injured in a makeshift hospital. The doctors have sent in an important list of instructions for them to follow." Evan and Seth exchanged knowing glances. "Where did she learn CPR?" the male reporter asked. "Apparently, Uncle Louis taught her," the other reporter smiled. "How does he know all these things?" "Believe it or not, they are connected to the internet inside the dome. Uncle Louis can Google anything," she added with a laugh. Closing the story, the female reporter appealed to her audience. "I'm sure that we are all cheering for Uncle Louis, Zahir, and Ponzi to pull through these critical hours. In the meantime, the Paradise attraction at the Greenville Biosphere will not be open to the public until further notice. And sadly, as we've been reporting in the last few days, Professor Lemans has been stripped of his tenure and is facing huge fines for his unethical conduct in this experiment." Evan sighed, knowing that he was also complicit in all that had gone on, and wondering if his own career might be affected. What troubles lay ahead? "It doesn't matter," he told himself. "I'm part of this, and I'm seeing it through to the end." The announcer went on to discuss an outbreak of a deadly new disease that was making inroads among a certain demographic of the population. There are already 500 cases in Canada. "I don't fully understand suffering," Evan remarked to Seth. "Do terrible things just happen by chance and God looks the other way? Or does he actually bring suffering upon our world?" Sitting back in his chair, Seth reflected thoughtfully on the question. "Both can be true," he replied. "We're told in Ecclesiastes that time and chance happens to all. Our world is a living, dynamic planet, and sometimes we get in the way of the inbuilt forces of nature. God hasn't promised to protect us from every danger. But he has promised to bring us back to life if we put our trust in him. But sometimes God will bring suffering? Yes, Seth nodded. We live in a cursed world because of sin. In the past, God has brought fire, disease, pestilence, strong winds, even a global flood to punish those who rebelled against him. And he has promised he will use these forces to judge our world. We are in the last days before Jesus returns, and for the most part, our society has rejected God's standards and the purpose that he has for his creation. Evan mused over the answer. So sometimes we suffer for our own decisions, or the decisions of our society, and sometimes we are subject to time and chance. And sometimes our sufferings might even be for the benefit of others, like Job or Jesus, Seth added. Suffering actually has a very important purpose. It's not necessarily a punishment. As the Apostle Paul says in Romans 5, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. Suffering can produce strong character and strengthen our relationship with God. It isn't intended to make us bitter and turn away. It is part of God's plan to test if our relationship with him will withstand adversity. Evan looked at him thoughtfully and nodded. And I suppose suffering can help us develop empathy for others, he added, thinking of various instances where he had seen this happen in paradise. Maybe it also helps us to value what we have more highly. Speaking of valuing our gifts, Seth reflected, would we appreciate God's willingness to forgive and his merciful heart if we've never experienced the shame and disgrace of failure? And would we see the need to share this mercy and kindness with others? With a downcast expression, Evan said, I wish I could help Jack see all this. Sadly, he's chosen the bitter route. Seth sighed deeply as he collected his used napkin and utensils on his dirty plate. Unfortunately, some view God as a genie in a bottle, he remarked. Our Father in heaven isn't there only to grant all our wishes and provide us with a comfortable life, like Professor Lemans is trying to do in paradise. When we're feeling happy, it's easy to have faith that he exists. But when bad things happen, even believers can quickly begin to question if God is real. Yet he purposely chooses to test our commitment and see if we will truly love him with all our heart, even when things are tough, or if we are only in love with his gifts. Chapter 13. A long night. Amy woke up to the sound of Uncle Louis's voice. He was calling for her. She sat bolt upright in bed. The night air was always cooler than during the day. Pulling on the long white shirt that Dia had made for her, Amy noted that the bed beside hers was empty. She didn't have time to wonder where Lily might be. Running out of the room, she could hear groaning. Kenzie met her in the dark hallway. Zahir and Ponce are really unwell. I don't know what to do, he expressed anxiously. Rushing into the room, Amy was thankful for the solar twinkle lights that had been tied up around her big window. She could see that Zahir and Ponce were tossing restlessly and moaning. Amy, Uncle Louis directed, feel their foreheads. Taking off the wet cloth, she placed her hand on Zahir's head. He's burning hot, she exclaimed. Quickly she assessed Ponce. She took their temperatures. They were both at nearly 40 degrees Celsius. Taking their pulses, she also noted their heart rates were up and they were breathing quickly. Uncle Louis called her to his side. You know what you need to do, he whispered. Send a message. Relay their temperatures. Explain that Zahir and Ponce are hallucinating and feverish. No doubt they are fighting infection. I believe these men need stronger medication. With an unusual urgency to his voice, Uncle Louis implored, Hurry, Amy. Kenzie was looking over curiously. Sensing that this was a crisis, Amy fairly flew out of the house. It was dark. It was hard to see in the forest as she climbed down Rainbow Hill, but Amy was thankful for the stairs Odin had set in place. I can't lose them, she kept telling herself all the way to the cave. I can't lose them. She found the key under the rock, opened the door, and turned on the light. Quite distraught, Amy sent an urgent message to the professor and hoped with all her heart that he would reply. Within a minute, there was an answer. "I'll contact the doctor immediately. Redo the wet cloths. Give them another dose of pain medication and force them to drink more fluids. This will help cool them down. Then wait by the store for the train. We'll send stronger antibiotics." Locking up the cave, Amy quickly showered and made her way back up to the caring center. She passed on the instructions to Kenzie. Once they had relayed wet cloths on both the patients and forced them to drink the medicine, Amy stood up to leave. "Where are you going again?" Kenzie asked, looking desperately at Amy. "Please stay and help me." Pausing, a look of anguish passed over her face. "More medicine is being sent in," she explained quietly. "I have to wait for it to come in on the train." "How do you know all these things?" he implored. Looking over at Uncle Louis, Amy wasn't sure how to respond. She didn't want to be dishonest. "She's talking to the professor, like I used to do down in the cave," Uncle Louis said quietly, taking the liberty to include Kenzie in the secret. "Please keep this to yourself." Astonished, the young man didn't know what to say. Amy fled through the dark forest and across the meadow to the train tracks. When it began to rain, she sat under the veranda of the store. A long time passed by. She yearned to be back in the caring center where she could see how Zahir was faring and do something to help, even if it was only to hold his hand. "But I'm thankful that Kenzie and Uncle Louis are with him," she assured herself. "Even if Uncle Louis has to stay in bed, he knows what to do. I must wait here for the medicine." Sitting out in the cool darkness, Amy had plenty of time to reflect. While she was distressed for all three of the patients in her room, her heart was wrapped around two of them in particular. Both were her main source of comfort and reassurance. Both gave warm hugs, encouraging remarks, and kind smiles. Life in paradise would not be the same without them. She knew that just as she had watched Zahir's dog grow old and die, she was watching Uncle Louis fade away. Losing Uncle Louis would be terrible enough. Losing Zahir? Well, the thought of losing Zahir seemed impossible to bear. "He saved Ponzi's life," she agonized. "It would be so unfair for him to lose his own just because he was kind. And Zahir is still so young and... Sobs burst out as Amy bent over with her face in her hands. The courageous actions of her friend during the fire had completely won her heart. "I love Zahir," she cried out. "I love him more than anyone else." Tears rolled down her face as her mind went back to the dark night when she had stood on Rainbow Hill and sung the saddest song of her life. She sobbed harder as she remembered Zahir joining her and turning her sad song into one filled with comfort and joy. He had brought light into the darkness. In her mind, there was no one else quite so special. Almost half an hour went by very slowly as Amy sat under the shelter of the veranda, impatiently waiting for the train and reliving old memories. She was thankful she had put on the long white shirt so she could wrap it around herself in the cool night air. Huddled in the folds of cloth while the rainmaker passed over the roof time and again, something became very clear in her mind. There were two people in paradise she couldn't bear to lose, and she certainly couldn't bear to lose them both at once. "Even if Zahir always belongs to Georgia," she sighed, "I will be thankful just to have him here in paradise. He gives the best smiles, he says the kindest things. I may never give him another long hug, but I will always appreciate his friendship." With longing eyes, she looked toward the train tunnel. "Please send that medicine in quickly," she begged, no one in particular. "Please let it work." Finally, the train came in. Little did the young nurse know how much turmoil and deliberation had gone on in the middle of the night on the other side of the glass. She didn't know that Farouk and Rachel Khalid had risen from a sound sleep, called Dr. Mark Montgomery, and made numerous calculations with him on the phone. Then Rachel had stayed back with Jordan while Farouk had driven to the hospital, where he packaged and labeled the stronger antibiotics in tiny bottles. The kind-hearted doctor had then driven across to the biosphere, met the professor in the parking lot, been ushered into the Paradise Room, and spoken careful instructions that Jax had written down in tiny, legible form. He was now standing outside the dark dome beside the professor, looking in with great anxiety. Deliberating softly with one another, they were trying to determine whether it would be best to bring the burn victims to their side of the world in the morning or not. Amy only knew that the train had arrived. When she rolled open the door of the first car, the lights came on inside, which helped her to see everything. Picking up the tall eyedropper bottles, she saw from the labels that there were 2 of each type of medication. Placing the extras on the ground beside the tracks, she gathered 1 of each new bottle and the written instructions. 2 was all that she could carry. Running across the dark field, Amy crossed Rainy River. Usually, it was just a dry riverbed, but since it was still raining, it was knee-high. She saw little rabbits scamper away and her dear friends watching her from the woods, but she hardly acknowledged the animals. If they were hungry, she knew they could always go to the store and eat from the compost pile. Important lives were at risk, and at that moment she could hardly think about anything else. She even forgot to shower. Kenzie was re-wetting the damp cloths for the patients when she came back to the softly lit room. With great relief, he ran over to take the big bottles from her arms. Zahir and Ponzi were still restless and moaning. Uncle Louis called out softly, "That's my girl." Standing by the window, Kenzie and Amy read the instructions. "Oh, I'm so thankful for these lights," she said, and he agreed. Together they measured out the dosages. Amy held the cups while Kenzie filled the dropper and squeezed it out into each one. Picking up Ponzi's cup, the weary male nurse took it to him. With the medication, Amy sat down in the chair between the 2 burn patients. She called out to Zahir, but it took a louder attempt to wake him. When his eyes fluttered open, he didn't even recognize her. He seemed to be in the middle of a nightmare and cried, "No, no, please don't fry me. No, not Fredo, not Fredo." With a sad smile, Amy wondered what terrible things were happening in Zahir's nightmare. He thrashed violently around, almost knocking the medication out of her hand. Kenzie had finished giving Ponzi his dosage, so he dashed over to hold Zahir's flailing arms down by his side. Gradually, they helped him drink the new antibiotics and some painkiller too. Seemingly oblivious to their presence, Zahir swallowed mechanically. Then it was time to administer the protein formula and more water, all the while restraining their hallucinating patients. Once the doses had been given out, Kenzie yawned and rubbed his eyes. He hadn't had any sleep all night. Amy said, "I can take a turn with them, if you like. I'm wide awake." "Thank you," he nodded gratefully. "Even an hour or 2 would be great. Just wake me up if you need any help." Exhausted, he collapsed into the extra bed. After changing the wet cloths on her patients again, Amy settled on the chair between them, taking both their hands and hoping with all her heart that the medicine would soon take effect. "Fredo! Fredo!" Zahir called out in distress. With deep compassion, Amy assured him that Fredo was okay. Near dawn, the young man began to relax. Their foreheads became cooler to the touch. Ponzi fell into a sound sleep. Amy turned her full attention to Zahir. He wasn't thrashing around as much as before. Hopeful melodies welled up inside her heart. She didn't want to wake anyone, so she kept her voice soft and low.
"I want to see you in the morning,"
she sang, just barely above a whisper.
"Alive, awake and well,"
she hummed quietly as she thought of the next line.
"May the sun brighten up your face and give me good news to tell."
Tears welled up as she continued.
"I'd like to see some recognition when you open up your eyes. And most of all, I want you to always stay alive."
Repeating the song once more, Amy began to feel very tired. Not wanting to leave her patients while they were dangerously ill, even if they were now both sleeping peacefully, she curled up on the sofa, wrapping herself in a spare blanket. One last line came to her, and she quietly murmured the words,
"Because without you, I don't think I would survive."
Chapter 14. The Lady in White. Slowly Amy became aware of her surroundings. Little birds were singing in the trees and squirrels were chattering away. Sunlight was filling the room, while smells of ointment and unpleasantries wafted past her nose. And then she heard a faint groan. With a start, she came to and sat bolt upright on the pink couch in the caring center. Zahir's blue eyes were alert. "Did you stay in here all night?" he asked wearily. "Zahir, you look so much better!" she cried out with astonishment. Jumping up from the sofa, she ran over. Taking the damp cloth off his forehead, she felt his temperature. "You aren't burning up," she announced ecstatically. Wide-eyed, she looked over at Uncle Louis. Having been awake for a while, Uncle Louis cheered. "Oh, that is very good news indeed." "Why was he burning up?" Ponzi asked fearfully, confused. "You both had fevers," Uncle Louis replied. "You were fighting infection and you became far too hot. Thanks to Kenzie and Amy, you're doing much better this morning." Lethargically, Zahir reached over and clasped Amy's arm. "Thank you, Nurse Amy," he said gratefully. "And you too, Kenzie," he nodded at his friend. "I had so many strange, scary dreams," Ponzi mumbled, peeling off the cloth in his chest. "But there was also this beautiful lady in white who sometimes turned into a butterfly." He smiled, looking over at Amy in her long, wrinkled shirt. She was singing a really pretty song. "Nice," Zahir mumbled wearily. "Mine were just scary. This nasty creature was trying to kill me and Fredo. I kept trying to save my dog, but..." He paused to catch his breath. "Come to think of it," he reflected thoughtfully, "that creature had a gigantic frying pan." Amy laughed. She sat down between her patients and reached for Zahir's good hand. Seeing him alive and talkative generated immense joy and relief. She wanted to dance around the room and sing her song again, but instead she teased kindly. "Maybe you're feeling guilty for all those poor fish you've caught." Ponzi laughed. "Could be." Zahir's eyes were smiling. He squeezed the hand that was holding his. Uncle Louis piped up. "I also heard the lady in white," he said, his eyes twinkling. "And I think she got her wish this morning." Looking over at Amy, he winked. "Me too," Kenzie piped up quietly, picking up the bottle of pain medication. "What? You all heard a song and I missed out?" Zahir mumbled. Looking slowly over at Kenzie, Ponzi, and Uncle Louis, he then turned back to Amy. "How'd it go?" But the others couldn't remember the details, and Amy didn't think Georgia would appreciate the song being sung again. Her housemates would soon be getting up. With a teasing expression, she just smiled at her dark-haired patient. "So, was there a song or not?" he begged. Amy shrugged. "You and Ponzi were imagining all sorts of strange things," she laughed, patting his hand. Georgia poked her head in to greet the patients before heading to the store. Her eyes glanced around the room. Wet cloths were still on Zahir's chest. A bowl of water sat on the floor, and new bottles of medicine crowded the side table. One nurse was sitting very close to the dark-haired patient. "Was it a rough night?" she asked tentatively. "They were very feverish," Amy told her. "I was really afraid they weren't going to make it." "Seriously?" Georgia questioned, her green eyes narrowing. "It was that bad? Is that why you're holding Zahir's hand?" Blushing, Amy felt guilty, even though she had convinced herself that her needy patients required extra care. Zahir let go and she stood up to walk away. Kenzie frowned. "It's like you're taking advantage of this situation and stealing my man," Georgia protested angrily. "I have to go and cook every day in the kitchen, and you're sitting in here holding hands with Zahir." Uncle Louis smiled. "Holding hands is an important part of the healing process," he informed the angry blonde. "Amy is just being a good nurse. She holds my hand, too." "And mine," Ponzi piped up. "Don't be so hard on the nurses," Kenzie argued. "Amy's only doing the job she's been asked to do." Nevertheless, rather mortified, Amy decided the hand-holding had run its course. Ponzi and Zahir were no longer in such desperate pain. A little shaky, she turned away and began folding the blanket on the sofa. There was no doubt her actions were hurting Georgia, who had also accused her of stealing. Was she guilty of breaking the only 2 rules in paradise? Inwardly, she began justifying her conduct. But she remembered Uncle Louis's principle. Do unto others as you would have done unto you. Putting herself in Georgia's position, she considered that if she were the girlfriend and Georgia the nurse, she would be equally upset. In a soothing voice, Georgia offered, I'll come hold your hands here when I'm done serving breakfast. I love you, she called out cheerily. I love you too, Zahir responded with a dutiful tone. There was no doubt that the 2 still shared a special relationship. Amy knew she needed to be respectful of the feelings on both sides. Georgia smiled at the patient, glared jealously at Amy, and left the room. Voices called out from across the hall. Hey, what about us? We need some hand-holding in here. We're in so much pain. Who loves us? There was a chorus of laughter from the other room, but Amy didn't smile. Charlie and Milan brought in a large, heavy package that they had carried all the way from the train. It was wrapped in brown paper with Uncle Louis's name in bold letters. Vahid followed with a smaller package in the same brown paper. You can leave those here by my bed, Uncle Louis smiled, pointing to the window seat beside him. What are they? Vahid queried. They feel like schoolbooks. With a chuckle he asked, Do Zahir and Ponzi have to do school up here with you? He winked at Ponzi, and Ponzi groaned. They are books that I am studying, Uncle Louis told him. If either one is accurate, it may become a school lesson one day. Rather shaken, but trying her best not to show it, Amy began her rounds of pain medication with Kenzie. Glumly, she decided the pink sofa would be the best place to sit when talking to her patients. It was far enough away that hand-holding was not an option. She didn't want to provoke another jealous reaction from Georgia. Chapter 15. Healing. After all the bandages were changed that afternoon and the medicine doled out, Zahir and Ponzi soon fell asleep again. Their temperatures remained steady, just a little above normal, and the smell was dissipating. But seeing the young men were having another nap, she decided to go across the hall and play games with the Beach Boys and Santa instead. Chess was becoming quite popular, and so were card games. Amy slipped out to give another report down in the cave. Thrilled to share her good news with the professor, she hummed the new song that she had sung to Zahir. To her surprise, she met Lily in the forest. Where are you off to? Lily demanded suspiciously. I'm just enjoying the forest, Amy laughed, immediately feeling uncomfortable with half-truths. Of course, Lily nodded merrily. Write some songs while you're walking around. She tossed her head back proudly. See you later when you're finished talking to the professor. The professor, Amy echoed, pretending to be surprised by the remark. Talking to him? We know that's where you're going, Lily shrugged. It's obvious that Uncle Louis can't talk to him anymore, and somehow the train keeps coming back and forth with all the right supplies. I'm not sure where you're getting these ideas from, Amy said. I'm just not sure why you were chosen, Lily admitted, unless it's because you're one of the nurses. Alarmed that her secret was already out, Amy walked through the darkest part of the forest, climbing over a few more fallen trees. Carefully she found her way to the cave and took the key from under the rock. Once inside, she turned on the light and closed the door. There were dirty streaks on the phone. The letter she had received from the professor was upside down, and she was sure she had left it right side up. Has Lily or someone else been in here? She wondered anxiously. Or did I leave this mess? She used the cloth that was on Uncle Louis's desk and wiped the screen. I'd better keep this key with me, she decided. Maybe someone saw me put it under the rock. Pressing the White Dove app and making a video call to the professor, Amy sat down in the chair. It didn't take long for him to answer. Eager to share her good news with him, she told him all the details of the long night. Having been anxiously awaiting a message from her ever since he woke up that morning, Jax was overjoyed to hear that both patients' temperatures were almost normal. They were alert and talkative this morning, Amy recalled, clapping her hands together joyfully, and now they are both sleeping soundly again. Wildly thankful for the good news, Jax didn't tell her that he had stood with the doctor deliberating anxiously for an hour in the night, slept on the cot in the lab, and been unable to concentrate on anything else since he woke up. This is wonderful, wonderful news, he rejoiced, relieved that the patients could remain in the dome. I'm so proud of you, Amy. You followed the instructions well, and am very thankful that you messaged me when there was a problem. Amy was grateful for the new medication and formula. I'm so happy the guys are better, she exclaimed. I couldn't bear to lose them. I couldn't either, he smiled pleasantly. You have some very special tinies in your care. Amy nodded enthusiastically. Then she remembered her conversations with Lily. She told the professor what Lily had said and also relayed that Uncle Louis had let Kenzie in on the secret. Jax was concerned. He pondered the matter. Once the others have figured out that you are communicating with me, there's not much we can do to keep it a secret, he said with resignation. Just try your best not to draw attention to this privilege. I don't want the others to react jealously towards you or find a way to use the phone inappropriately themselves. Please be sure to keep that key with you at all times. Nodding meekly, Amy didn't admit that she had been leaving it under a rock, but she told herself she had to be much more careful from now on. Showering before heading back to the caring center, Amy held tightly to the key. She begged Dia for a long piece of ribbon, and her housemate tossed her one of the many that she had hanging on pegs. Privately tying it around her neck, Amy hid the key under her dress. Another evening passed quickly as the 4 nurses changed dressings, cleaned wounds, monitored temperatures, and gave the correct dosages to each patient. Amy was thankful when Vahid arrived and it was time for bed. Kenzie left yawning, and Tina dashed off shortly after. Your last night was rough, Vahid said to Amy outside the room. She nodded wearily. I am so tired. But she went over the new instructions and showed him the bottles of medicine that they were now to use. Vahid was eager to take a turn. Get some sleep while you can. I'll take care of them all, he said. Lily was already in bed when Amy came in, and she mumbled good night to her. Amy fell asleep almost instantly. However, in the middle of the dark night, a strange noise woke Amy up. It was a heavy rumble that reverberated up and down her spine. Not only was the rumble intense, but she could feel a warm circle of pressure on her lower back. Turning over, she felt a heavy body slip off with an annoyed meow. Amy could hardly believe that a cat had been sleeping on top of her. Ever since Ripple had begun killing small animals and birds, like colors, cats had become the one and only animal Amy did not like. However, she grudgingly picked up the sleepy, very large cat. It was dark and hard to see, but Amy knew by its size that it had to be Yuyan's pet, Mia. Why are you here again, Mia? She whispered as she quietly took her downstairs. And why would you choose to sleep on me, of all the people in this house? Putting the cat outside, Amy said softly, Go home to Yuyan. That's your girl. Then she tiptoed back upstairs to Lily's room. However, when she climbed back into her bed, she realized that Lily was not beside her. Her bed was empty. This is strange, Amy thought, recalling that Lily's bed had been empty the night before when she had awoken Uncle Louis's urgent call. As Amy contemplated her friend's absence, suddenly a noise at the window startled her. The silhouette of a head appeared, and Amy sat up wide awake. As the petite girl climbed through the window, Amy recognized her roommate. What are you doing? Amy asked, bewildered. Oh, it's just the easiest way to get in, Lily whispered. I had to visit the outhouse. I didn't want to wake anyone up. Easiest way? Amy clarified wearily, lying back down. You must be a good climber. When the light of dawn spilled in the next morning, Amy looked over immediately to see if Lily was still there. Sound asleep, her roommate's dark hair overflowed her pillow. Dirt was in her hair. The copper-haired nurse observed her friend carefully. There were also muddy streaks on Lily's elbow. Rolling over, the petite girl opened her eyes. You're always up so early, she moaned. What were you doing last night? Amy inquired curiously. Did you roll down the hill? No, Lily flushed. Why? Following Amy's eyes, Lily looked at her arm. She saw the streaks. She sat up and saw the dirt on her pillow. Come to think of it, Lily replied hastily, I fell. It was dark last night and hard to see. True, Amy nodded. It was. With a laugh, she added, Do you have any cuts? I can fix them up for you. Lily shook her head with a smile. No, I'm fine, thanks. It was a soft tumble. I didn't realize it got so dirty. It was dark, you know. As Amy pulled on her clothes, Lily added, I really appreciate how well you're looking after Ponzi. I'm so glad he's getting better. He says you're a very good nurse. With a smile, Amy said, Thanks, Lily. I love this job.